Good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 12 of Talkin' Tunes with Dr. Tony. I believe I have a very good program today that I'm going to be presenting, and I'm going to be talking about 4 different albums that I picked randomly from my collection. And the good news is that I'm very familiar with all 4 of these records. I've listened to them many times, and I like them quite a bit. So without any further delay, let's just jump right into it. The first band is the Dutch group Focus, and the album I'm going to be discussing goes by 2 names. In North America, it was called Moving Waves, but in the rest of the world, it was called Focus 2, and it was released in 1971, and the album was very successful. It reached number 8 in the US Billboard, number 2 in the UK ratings, and number 4 in the Netherlands. And it was a gold record in the United States. Now, I believe this is primarily based on the strength of the idiosyncratic single from the album called Hocus Pocus, which reached number 9 in the United States. Now, many people believe because of this single that Focus was a one-trick pony, but they really were not, because they had 11 studio albums during their tenure, and 6 of them are live. Now, I want to bring to your attention the album called At the Rainbow, or Focus Live at the Rainbow, from 1973. This is an amazing record. It's one of my favorite live recordings of all time, and that album includes 3 cuts from the album Moving Waves. So as you probably can guess, since it was called Focus 2, this was Focus's second album, and they welcomed 2 new members, a bass player and a drummer, but the 2 main guys from the original band remained, and they were Jan Akkerman on guitar and Thijs van Leer on keyboards, flute, and vocals. Now, one thing I want to bring to your attention, in 1973, Jan Akkerman was rated as the world's best guitar player in the prestigious and highly regarded UK music newspaper called Melody Maker. Now, this was their equivalent of Rolling Stone, but it was entirely about music. And I used to read it quite a bit in the early 70s, and I learned a great deal about British and European bands that had not cracked the American market, but that were very popular in either the UK or the rest of Europe. So the album Moving Waves is mostly instrumental, and it's very sad that people only know Focus by Hocus Pocus. And another Dutch band suffered a similar fate as Focus, and that band was Golden Earring. And you may know them from the song Radar Love, which was number 13 on the US charts in 1973. Although they did have another hit single with a song called The Twilight Zone in 1982, which reached number 10 in the US charts. So Golden Earring had 26 studio albums, so they were not just a one-trick pony. And I got to see them live in concert with Bebop Deluxe in 1976 at the Santa Monica Civic. And the thing I wanted to mention about Golden Earring is that they had 2 original members that were with the band for 61 years. That was George Koymans on guitar, who was one of the principal songwriters, and also Rinus Gerritsen, who played bass and keyboards. So they were with Golden Earring from 1961 to 2021, and they finally called it quits because George Koymans contracted ALS, which is also known as Lou Gehrig disease. So you know that there's not a lot of hope for recovery from that. But the best album from Golden Earring, I know I'm digressing a little bit from Focus, but I wanted to take this opportunity to give a plug for Golden Earring. Their best album, in my opinion, is Moontan from 1973. And this is the album that has Radar Love, but it also has two songs that are great called Candy's Going Bad and Vanilla Queen, and a couple other Golden Earring songs that you could probably find. One is called She Flies on Strange Wings, which came out before 73. And another one is called Ce Soir, which in, I guess, Dutch means kill me, which came out after 73. So I highly recommend those two songs. So that album, Moontan for Golden Earring, it reached number 12 in the US. So before I get into Moving Waves in some detail, I want to give a shout out to another Dutch band that you probably know, and this may be the first Dutch band to crack the US market, and the band was Shocking Blue, and their song was Venus. I'm your Venus, I'm your fire and joy, desire is the chorus, and that actually went to number 1 in the United States. So that's a very great song. All right, so moving right along. So Moving Waves opens with Hocus Pocus, and there was a single version which is shortened, and this one, of course, is the longer LP version. And then a couple cuts later, you get to the song Moving Waves, and this has one of the rare vocals from Thijs van Leer. It's a beautiful song. The piano is very reminiscent of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And then side 1 closes with the song called Focus 2, which is an instrumental, and there's a beautiful melody being played by Jan Akkerman for most of the song. Side 2 is dedicated to one song called Eruption, and it's a 22-minute suite that consists of 15 different movements, and much of it is similar to Frank Zappa's instrumental music. There's a recurring theme throughout that Eruption song. So overall, I would rate this album as a 8 out of 10. There is a site that I've been looking at called Rate Your Music, which has album reviews and ratings by just different people like me and you. They gave this album a 3.72 out of 5. But if you do have a chance to listen to Live at the Rainbow, that to me is a 10 out of 10 album. All right, so let's move on to the next group. And it's Faces. And the album is A Nod is as Good as a Wink to a Blind Horse. And this came from 1971. And this was the second album with the name Faces, but it was actually the third album with the reconstituted Faces band. So what happened with Faces, or actually Small Faces, Steve Marriott left the group and he was replaced by Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood. Now, the first album with the new personnel was called First Step from 1970. And in the United States, you would see on the cover, the band is called Small Faces. But in Europe, they were now called Faces. So this album comes after the album called Long Player. And Steve Marriott quit the Small Faces after a concert in 1968. He just walked off the stage and said, I'm done. And in the next year, he formed Humble Pie with Peter Frampton. And Steve Marriott, as the principal songwriter, singer, and lead guitar player, he was frustrated because the Small Faces had a teeny bopper or just a pop group image because they were 4 guys around the same height. They all had the same haircuts, and I guess the girls just loved them. But he wanted to get away from that image, so he left and wanted to form a more hard-edged group, which Humble Pie certainly was. Now, Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood left Jeff Beck's band in 1969, but in that group, Ron Wood played bass, not guitar. So The New Faces band was very different than the Small Faces because they were much more blues based and R&B oriented, and they were just kind of a good time band. A lot of people that were into them were partiers, and going to their concert was like a big party. So this album, Not Is As Good As a Wink, was their most successful album as the Faces. And it reached number 6 in the US and number 2 in the UK. And the popularity of the album was largely attributed to the single Stay With Me, which reached number 17 in the US. Now, I have always maintained that the Faces with Rod Stewart and the Stones during that era were relatively interchangeable parts, and I thought it would be an interesting experiment if you put Rod Stewart with the Stones and Mick Jagger with the Faces and go to their live concert and see how it would be. So I think that their sound is really similar, especially live. And to this point, Ron Wood did leave the Faces to join the Stones. So that kind of supports my argument about this. Now, the other thing about this album is Ronnie Lane, the bass player and original member of the Small Faces, he sings 3 songs. He sings You're So Rude and also Debris. And he's got a very cool voice. It's very different than Rod Stewart. And in the Kenny Jones autobiography, Kenny Jones was the drummer. He's talking about the Small Faces and Faces. He said that Ronnie Lane became frustrated because of lack of opportunity to sing. But if Rod Stewart is your lead singer, it's pretty difficult for you to get more time on the album. So Ronnie Lane eventually left and made a few solo albums, and he joined Peter Townsend for a really good album from 1977 called Rough Mix. So Ronnie Lane contracted multiple sclerosis and ended up dying in 1997, so his career was pretty much over for the last maybe 15, 20 years of his life. One of the criticisms of this album is that Rod Stewart kept the best songs for his solo album, and at the same time as Not Is As Good As a Wink, Rod Stewart released Every Picture Tells a Story, and that album, as you know, was really, really successful. So overall, I would give this album a 7 out of 10. I'm not a huge Faces fan, but I think it's pretty good. And Rate Your Music gave it a 3.61 out of 5. Okay, so let's go on to the third recording, and it's the Beach Boys. And the album is M.I.U. album, and it's from 1978. Now, some people could say, well, this album could be better called M.I.A. for Missing in Action, because Carl and Dennis Wilson barely participated in this record. And it's produced by Al Jardine, and Brian Wilson wrote much of it. It's the 22nd Beach Boys studio album, and it was recorded at the Maharishi International University in Fairfield, Ohio, during the dead of winter. Now, recording in Fairfield, Iowa is about as far away as the beach in Southern California as you could get, especially when you're recording during the winter. And just to put this in context, Fairfield, Iowa is about 200 miles from Clear Lake, Iowa, where Buddy Holly had the fatal plane crash also during the winter. So it was not the best environment, but what's really interesting is that many people call it one of the worst albums from the Beach Boys ever. And during this time, the Beach Boys were recovering from the Brian's back syndrome. So after the very excellent Sunflower, Surf's Up, and Holland albums from 70, 71, and 73, the Beach Boys then did 15 big ones in 1976, Love You in 1977, then MIU album in 78, and then they did LA Light album in 1979. So all four of these albums were panned by the critics, and they did not sell well. So the problem is Sunflower and Surf's Up and Holland. Brian Wilson does very few vocals on those albums, even though he did write some of the songs. Those three albums represent the Beach Boys at their most excellent in terms of their musicianship and also the production and the songwriting. They are very, very great albums. When Brian Wilson returned to do 15 Big Ones, which was all covers in 1976, it was such a big step back, especially since the first song on that album is Rock and Roll Music, which Mike Love's vocal on that is probably one of the worst vocals I could ever want to listen to. If you ever listen to the Beach Boys Party, there's a dialogue between Brian Wilson and Mike Love where they're making fun of each other's voice. And Brian does a nasal thing of Mike Love, just give me some of that rock and roll, like that. And that's how this song sounds. It's nowhere near as good as Chuck Berry or the Beatles. So those four albums, the songwriting is not that fantastic, and it's very simple, and the vocals are not that good because Brian sings a lot of them, and they just don't hold up compared to those three albums I just mentioned. But as you may know, I have more Beach Boys and Brian Wilson recordings in my collection than any other artist. So I'm an unabashed fan, and I'm pretty forgiving. Even when Brian was struggling during this time with his weight and his sobriety, he was still able to come up come through on occasion with a lot of song gems that are just fantastic. So I consider Brian Wilson and Frank Zappa as the two musical geniuses of the second half of the 20th century in popular music. And I maintain if Brian would have had a partner to work with like Lennon had McCartney, I think that Brian would have been able to survive and sustain his excellence. Even though he did have a collaborator, primarily a lyricist, Brian was pretty much on his own to write the music, to do the arrangements, a lot of the production, and because of a variety of circumstances, he just went off the deep end. But it's a real testament to his strength that he's able to continue on what he's doing today. So this album, MIU album, it only charted number 151 on the Billboard 200. There's 12 songs, and none are over 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and 9 of them are less than 3 minutes. So I think that this record could have been a fantastic EP because I think there are maybe 4 or 5 songs here that are really, really good. So it opens up with a song called She's Got Rhythm, and Brian is doing a falsetto, which is something that you've not heard him do in a long, long time. There are a couple cover songs on this album that are completely skippable. It's Come Go With Me and Peggy Sue. And Al Jardine has a real fondness for these types of cover songs, and I just don't think that they work at all, so you could skip those. Now, there's a song called Hey Little Tomboy, and you may remember another song on the Beach Boys' Love You called I Want to Pick You Up. They're both kind of creepy songs if you go through the lyrics, but Hey Little Tomboy is less creepy, and it's written by Brian Wilson, and he handles the vocals with Mike Love. There's another song, Kona Coast, that's written by Mike Love and Al Jardine, and they share the vocals. And this is definitely a song that's reminiscent of Hawaii. And you have the refrain, let's go to Hawaii, Hawaii. It's right in there. So it's definitely derivative, but it's worth listening to for sure. And Al's voice is great. As a matter of fact, I want to give a shout out to Al Jardine because he's still performing live with Brian Wilson quite frequently and has been on a few of the Brian solo albums. And his voice is in very, very good shape. Without a doubt, he's the best live singer of any of the former Beach Boys. Now, we also have the song, Won't You Come Out Tonight? And this is a Mike Love, Brian Wilson collaboration on the writing and singing. Great, great throwback to the Beach Boys, and I really recommend it. Now, on side 2, there's one good song and there's one fantastic song. And as a matter of fact, the 2 songs that I'm going to talk about and the ones I've just mentioned, I think they are better than anything on 15 Big Ones, Love You, and the LA Light album. So I don't think that this album really deserves the criticism it received. I don't know why, but I think if you take time and listen to these songs I'm recommending, and you are a Beach Boys fan, you will see what I mean. So the 2 songs on side 2 I want to mention. The first one is called Pitter Patter. And again, it's got an Al Jardine lead vocal. And it was written by Al Jardine, Mike Love, and Brian Wilson. So it's really the best Beach Boy collaboration that you could have for songwriting. Now I want to mention that Carl Wilson has one song on this side that he sings. And then Dennis Wilson sings a song called My Diane, which is supposed to be a song that Brian wrote about his unrequited love for his first wife's, Marilyn's sister, whose name was Diane. It's not a very good song, but the song I want to talk about now makes it all worthwhile to listen and to buy this album. And the name of the song is Match Point of Our Love. Now, this is a Mike Love and Brian Wilson composition, but Brian handles the vocals all by himself, and his voice is amazing. I think the song is cashing in on the tennis craze that was sweeping the world in 1978, because there's all kinds of tennis imagery in the lyrics. But Brian, to my ears, almost sounds like he did during his peak in the middle to late 1960s. So overall, I would give this album a 7 out of 10. If it was an EP and we just had the songs that I mentioned, I'd give it a 10 out of 10. But again, I'm biased because I love Brian Wilson so much, and it's just great to see when he's able to resurface and to capture some of the greatness, because he wasn't always able to do that in a lot of these albums from the 1970s. So Rate Your Music gave this a 2.38 out of 5. So again, I wouldn't go by those ratings, but check it out. Okay, the last album of the day is Wheels of Fire by Cream, 1968. So this is a double album, one studio recording and one live. Now, if you are not that familiar with Cream, they were rock's first power trio, forming in 1966 with bass, guitar, and drums. And they were followed in this configuration by ZZ Top, Rush, and others. So I think that this is Clapton's best work, but his career is really, really amazing because he really didn't stick with too many things for very long. So after he was in the Yardbirds, he left because they were too teeny bopper and he wanted to play blues, so he went with John Mayall. Then he joined Cream, and then I think he left Cream because he didn't want to do the blues rock thing anymore. So then he formed Blind Faith with Steve Winwood. Then he went on to Delaney and Bonnie, then Derek and the Dominoes, and then he went solo. So for a while there, when Eric Clapton left Cream, he approached the band. He wanted to join the band, and he never really came out and asked them if he could join, but he did visit them in Woodstock, New York. And that would have been interesting because when you think of the work he did with Cream, it really is very different than the type of music the band made. So this album, Wheels of Fire, is Cream's third album, and it's got a great album cover. So in the studio record, there are hits. So White Room is probably the most well-known song, and I've heard that song so many times I really don't need to hear it again. We also have the song Politician, which was really good. Now, I never got to see Cream, but I did get to see Jack Bruce with West, Bruce, and Lang. So Leslie West from Mountain was playing the guitar, and they did Politician, and it sounded just like Cream. It was amazing. But Leslie West was no Eric Clapton, and I got to see Eric Clapton in concert as part of the Arms concert. I think I may have mentioned that before, which was a benefit concert with Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page for Ronnie Lane. Now, there's also a couple traditional blues songs here that are opposite. So we got Spoonful, which was arranged by Howlin' Wolf, and we also have Born Under a Bad Sign, which was written by Booker T. Jones from Booker T. and the MGs, and those two are great songs. We also have Ginger Baker, amazingly, the drummer, writing 3 songs. And the one that's most interesting is Pressed Rat and Warthog, where Ginger does the vocals. He's really just talking because he can't sing. One song that I want to mention is a song called As You Said. On this one, Jack Bruce plays cello and acoustic guitar, and it sounds a lot like Donovan. Another couple of great songs are Those Were the Days and Deserted Cities of the Heart. And this studio album is a Jack Bruce tour de force. There are no lead vocals from Eric Clapton on the studio record of Wheels of Fire. And Eric was very reluctant to take any leadership position in Cream, especially on the vocals. He did a little bit of singing on the first couple albums, which was Fresh Cream and then Disraeli Gears, but he just did backup vocals on this studio album. Now, the live side is from the Winterland concerts in San Francisco from 1968. And if you've ever heard Live Cream from 1970 and Live Cream 2 from 1971, both of those albums draw from the 1968 tour at Winterland. So the first side of the album has Crossroads, which is really good. Eric Clapton sings that, and that's great. But the second live side, this is where things start to fall apart for me, because you have 2 songs. You have Train Time, there's Too Much Harmonica, and you also have Toad. There's too long of a drum solo. So I would rate this album with just the first 3 sides as a 10 out of 10. But given side 4, I would give it an 8 out of 10. And Rate Your Music gave this album a 3.72 out of 5. So those are the 4 albums that I had for you today. And as I always, I've recently been mentioning, I would like you to subscribe to my videos, and I would really appreciate comments. I know a lot of you know these bands and these recordings, so when you're watching them, if something comes to mind, just jot it down on a piece of paper, or you could, I guess, just type the comment in anytime while you're watching. And if you thought I did a good job, go ahead and click like. So that's all I have for you today. To give you a sneak peek of next time, I'm going to go back and do a trifecta video of 3 albums in succession that were arguably better than what came before and arguably better than what came after. So I hope you'll tune in for that video that I record next week. I hope everybody has a blessed day, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.